Hi everyone, welcome to the University of Hertfordshire School of Humanities Creative Conversation event. It's in conjunction with what we've called the Poetry Hub, which is an initiative that I set up a few years ago to promote the practice of poetry at the University of Hertfordshire and the surrounding community. So my name's, for those of you that don't know me, Wayne Holloway Smith, and I'm a poet and I also lecture in creative writing at the University of Hertfordshire. Tonight we're going to be talking to Inua Ellams, who is a long-standing friend of mine and someone whose work I really admire. He is now the Poetry Fellow at the University of Hertfordshire and working with the Poetry Hub um, poetry to the students and the wider community. We're going to be talking a little bit in general and meeting and getting to know Inua, but specifically we're going to be hearing from him with respect to his new collection, his first full collection of poems, which is sort of hard to believe because I've known Inua and read his work for many years. Um, so I'm just going to read a little bit because what you have to do in these readings, you kind of have to introduce the person. The problem with introducing Inua is it could literally take the entire hour because the man's done more things than anyone else. But so I'm going to cut it short. I think that the easiest thing to do is read the biographical information from his new collection. So Inua Ellams, born in Nigeria, Inua Ellams is a UK-based poet, playwright, and performer who has written for the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Theatre, and the BBC. His latest play was an adaptation of Chekhov's Three Sisters set in Nigeria, staged at the National Theatre. The actual is Inua's fifth poetry release and first full collection after 13 Fairy Negro Tales, Candy Coloured Unicorns and Converse All Stars, The Wire Headed Heathen, and The Half God of Rainfall. So at this point, everyone would usually clap as I say, let's welcome Inua Ellams. But obviously, we're predominantly just staring at a bunch of names on the screen. All the claps are coming in anyway, which I'm enjoying. Inua, maybe you could just sort of introduce yourself to the community at the University of Hertfordshire, and for those of you that don't know you or haven't met you before.
Yeah. Um, I guess Wayne has done the bulk of that work. What else is there to add? Let me see. I started writing around 2003. Well, that was the first time someone called me a writer. Before that, I was just listening to hip hop and trying to rhyme on sheets of paper. Um, I started writing initially in Dublin when something really tragic happened, and I wrote about this in a book called After Hours, where my best friend was a guy called Stephen Devine, and Stephen and I um, sort of carried out our relationship purely through the sport of argument, and the arguments were never about winning. It was just to outdo each other with language, to be more precise, more specific, more elaborate with words. And Stephen used to call me Sheikh El Spear because of my surname Ellams, and he thought I'd be a writer, even though I was again just far too interested in watching Smallville. But in my penultimate year in Dublin, Stephen was going through various types of depressions which he couldn't articulate to anyone, including myself. And Stephen took his own life. And the following year, I started writing as a way to remember the argument Stephen and I had had. It was an active memory of witness. And to me, that's what governs a lot of my practice as a writer, who I try to, whose experience I try to articulate, or what aspects of my experience that in articulating helps others. So that attempt to bear witness, to understand, to explain the inexplicable really governs a lot about my work, and also the kinds of poetry that I write. I don't really create poetry that uses language to mystify. I really approach poetry in an attempt to democratize language, and that's definitely couched in my Nigerianhood, in the fact that Nigeria was colonized by the British, and English was forced to my people, was forced down on us, which meant that there are aspects of my character, of my culture, of my lineage that I don't have access to because I grew up only speaking English because my parents and my grandparents thought that it was the best way to progress in the world. So English was forced down our collective throats, and it's the language that I use. And when I begin to create art with it, I try to be as inclusive as possible, which means that I write certain other types of poetry. And I do enjoy the poems that are incredibly dense, that are detailed. And maybe when I first started writing, I created works like that. But these days, trying to be as simple and to be a witness and to be beautiful and to be rhythmic, to be lush is really where my poetics rest. That's where I drive from. Um, and yeah, I started writing around after Stephen's death. Came back to London, and the first time I read poetry was in 2003. Um, and it, and it came about because this was around the time when Channel 5, when I tried to be a proper channel, where after 9 p.m. they just showed soft porn, and that was the only thing available on the television channels. At least for a young man in South London who, because of my immigration difficulties, which I can discuss later, I couldn't work. I just had lots of time on my hands. So watching CD television at night was was good for me. But I remember watching an episode of a show called Real Sex where they'd interview people about the carnal desires on the streets of LA. And there was a poet reading a poem, and behind her, someone completely butt naked in a bathtub on stage, pouring water over their body and dancing erotically to the poem. And I remember praying to God that poetry events could be found like that in London. And I went to the event and there was no such thing. It was just people sitting around listening to poetry, but that also dazzled me. And that was the very first poetry event I attended in 2003, the first live literature event, the first live entertainment event. And after that, I became hooked. The guy who ran that event was called Nee Parks, who went on to become my first poetry mentor. And he published my first book called The 13 Fairy Negro Tales when I was 20 years old. And ever since then, yeah, I've been writing. After a while, I just dipped out and branched out into various types of writing long form poetry, which became narrative plays that I would perform myself, to writing multi-voiced monologues, which became radio plays, to writing stage plays, to writing plays that required tons of research, like Barbershop Chronicles, to adapting a whole bunch of poems by other poets, which became a book I wrote called After Hours, where I rewrote poems by British, Irish, Welsh, and Scottish poets. And then all of that was the groundings to adapt Chekhov's Three Sisters into the play. And along those times, I'm sorry, between those projects, I was just doing everything else and writing everything that I could. And all of that led to the actual, which came out earlier this year. Well, actually, about a month ago now, which I never intended to ever publish as a book. Um, there are a few, maybe 5 or 6 poems in the book are about climate change. So I'm hyper aware of my carbon footprint. And if you look at the stats about how many books are published each year, it's a roulette. You know, it's more likely for your book to cause no ripples whatsoever than for it to survive to sell more than 300 or 400 copies. And I'm hyper aware of that. So every time I want to publish a book, it has to be something. The book has to be more than just collections of poems. It has to be doing something else. After I was one of those projects where I rewrote poems, so it was an attempt to stand on the shoulders of giants and to recycle, and to create work that looked forward as it looked back. So it wasn't a collection of poems. It was more an anthology, and those who contributed to the anthology were everyone from Simon Armitage to what the name Pascal Petit to yeah. So I was rewriting their poems, then putting my voice alongside theirs. But in trying to rewrite their poems, I was trying to think about cultural translation and how language is necessarily mirrored, how it doesn't hold its meanings necessarily, and how the human spirit is necessarily transient. And I think I was trying to do all of those things in taking these poems by really well respected British poets and then deconstructing it and reconstructing it within my own Nigerian, Irish, English, immigrant, hip hop hood background. So that's why the book is an anthology. I had to publish my versions alongside theirs. So the meeting, um, yeah. So I guess what could be this? I guess my intention would be deciphered from the meetings of both poems, and this was just when conversations we're still happy we're still having now, we're beginning to just grow about British identity, about the legacy of empire and colonization. And yeah, I was just trying to create a body of work that spoke, that just addressed it simply by being. Um, so when it came to writing the actual, this was never my intention. What happened was Donald Trump said something else I found racist or sexist or pedantic or insulting, and I just started ranting on my phone. And I did so by gathering all the nicknames, all the insults I could find for him and stitching it into a very loose narrative. And because I spent so long working on the after hours and spent almost 3 to 4 years working on Three Sisters, all of which was about thinking about really deeply thinking about structure and finding poems and deconstructing each poem as though they were poem forms themselves. Because I spent all of that time thinking about breath, line, syntax, technique, blah blah blah. When it came to writing the actual, I just didn't want to give a fuck, excuse the pun. I just wanted to write with no brake pads, with no commas, no punctuation whatsoever. So I gave up all of that and just used the forward slash as the lone punctuation. And it serves various purposes in the book. But the first attempt was to stitch all of Donald Trump's nicknames and insults into a loose narrative, a structure. And I read it at a poetry event, and the host critiqued the poem, but told me she generally liked its intentions, and then dared me to write 45 more such poems. But I wrote 55, and it became this book. And I think my publish I signed a 2 book deal with HarperCollins, one of which was the purpose was to publish The Half God of Rainfall and to write a novel. And I'm terrified of writing novels. I have no idea what to write. But my but my agent kept on asking me, "Do you have a book? Do you have anything working?" And I said, "No, but I have this stream of like angry poems on my phone." And then I shared it with her, and she liked it, and kind of shared it with some other publishers. Um, but the person who came back, who was most earnest and most attentive, and really understood what I was trying to do with the poems, was a guy called Tom Chivers, who was the first person to publish me ever. And he owns Pen in the Margin Press. And yeah, we just began working on this book ever since. And I think I'm really I really like beautiful things, and I think we created something beautiful. The book is black and gold and shimmers in the light, and the poems are furious and reflective, but hopeful and hard. I don't know if yeah, a book could be described as such, but yeah, and that's where the actual came from. And the next thing I'm working on, well, I'm branching into working for television now. So I'm writing 3 different television series right now. Well, 2 of mine, then one for someone else. And I'm working on a feature film at the moment. And between that, I organize rap parties, poetry film hacks, which are events where I gather people to write films, sorry, poems about films, and then we stream them and watch them all in the same day. What else am I working on? I run the Midnight Run, which is a project where I gather strangers to explore a city from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. or from 6 p.m. to midnight, and invite local artists to run workshops or interventions during the course of these urban, excursions through cities at night. And I started working on that 15 years ago. This is our 15 year of operating. And we're going to have something stupid like 10 midnight runs this year, one in America, one in Ireland, one in Germany, a couple in Paris. But then the pandemic destroyed all of those things. So we're just in the midst of planning for next year. And yeah, that's in a nutshell. Yeah.
So all of those things that you have going on at the same time, basically, it's one of the reasons why, even though we live basically in very close proximity to each other. The only time we see each other is when you're getting off a bus and I'm getting on one, right? Or
Yeah.
occasionally you might walk past the cafe that I'm in or something and sit down with me while you eat one piece of fruit, and then you're like, all right, I've got to go to my next thing now.
It's
Like
not.
Inua, for people that don't know him, it is literally and has always been for as long as I've known him, which is 15 years, the hardest working man in poetry. And the events that he's talking about, which it's difficult to kind of communicate when you haven't taken part in one or experienced it, they're all rigorously thought out and incredibly entertaining. So even though the you didn't get your kind of wish when you first experienced poetry on Channel 5, like you are creating incredibly engaging environments, like over a multitude of platforms, which I think is why I was protesting vehemently for you to be made the poet laureate instead of Simon Armitage. um, what I think would be a really good idea. So we're going to open up towards the end of this hour. We've got until 6 o'clock. We're going to open up the chat. Anyone can type in a question, and I will kind of field those questions, as many of them as possible, to Inua towards the end of this event. But it'd be really nice if we could hear a few of your, well, as many as you want,
Yeah.
of the poems from the actual. I really want to celebrate this book with alongside you, because obviously we're big fans of each other's work and supporters, and I think this is definitely like a big marker in your career as a poet. I'm sure that people will be interested if you have any kind of little tidbits about each poem in between, or you read two and then tell us a little thing or whatever. However you'd like to present it, and whichever order you want to read the poems in, we'd just be quite grateful to hear. But I've got to make one request,
Yeah.
and that's that you got to start. We are basically on the cusp of Trump no longer being in power in America. So
Yeah.
maybe you could start with the poem that initiated this collection.
I think, yeah, I think that's a good shout. I'm going to start with those three sequences of poems because the first is about Trump. The second is about Theresa May, which was written after a poem of yours, Wayne, and the third is after Boris Johnson. So these poems essentially critique power um, and bad governance. And I'm going to start with Fuck 45. Though you've held his nicknames like bullets in your throat, Adolf Twitler, though you've loaded each chamber, Grabber the Hutt, cocked back your tongue, dubious Caesar, and let each shell blast the frustrated silence. Herman Mao, though you are ever gun ready, good to shoot from the lip, and the crew you roll with always come correct. Herr Hitler, Genghis Khan, Vanilla Ices, Toupee Fiasco, Clickwork Orange, though you chorus these forthright as Baptist hymns, making fellowship and communion of collective laughter. It's the night crossing the odd part of town, in another country or world away, on a street ravenous as morgues, a barefooted, dead-eyed white boy calls you nigger, as if a fact, as if their birthright. You learn the futility of laughter, its porous shield that words can slip through, can still break you, its power affirmed, let loose in the wild. And this too, Trump has done. And this is how the poems began, from a place of anger, but in exploring it, the poems kind of implode into something else. And this is a critique on power, on an insult, how they don't really work as a shield because it's a two-way mirror. It comes back and hits you. And this was the very first poem that I wrote. When I established the sequence of questioning power, and I read a poem. Wayne, what was the name of your poem? The one about all the Waynes.
Some Waynes.
Pardon?
Some Waynes, yeah.
Some Waynes, yeah. So when I read Some Waynes, this poem began to grow in me. And I have quite a number of Teresas in my life. And one of them is Teresa Lola, who worked with me for the rap party for a couple of years. And another is Teresa Coco, who wrote the most beautiful film called Rocks. And I really recommend you to watch it. It's on Netflix right now. It's just beautiful. But anyway, I mentioned those two Teresas here. Fuck 76. There's the poet Teresa L, who is half quantum furnace, half amazing. The social worker Teresa I, whose laughter is a coven of skinny dipping witches. The field hand Teresa S, who shakes the dawn from its covers. The teacher Teresa D, whose heart is a fallen country. The compassionate Teresa C, the police could no longer afford. The nurse Teresa E, who prized my sister from cancer's jaws. The community kitchen cook Teresa R, who brews magic out of beans and roots, and so many others who curse their muddied name. Look how they stand, grim faced, silent, jury of a unanimous guilty verdict, a cathedral of Teresas, a stadium full, led by Mother Teresa herself, her middle digit like a little stick of dynamite, their eyes locked on Theresa May. And this came because all those Teresas were complaining that when they Google searched their names, Theresa May popped up. And given how much she worked against feminism, and given that they were all feminists, they just thought she was bad news for the movement, and also that she had taken the shine out of their names a bit. And then I'm going to read Fuck 77, which is about yeah, actually, it would be interesting if you guys know who this is about. Yeah, maybe we'll ask if you guys do. When we mention you called all women naturally fickle, our men cannibals, our cousins pickaninnies, our smiles watermelon, our aunties letterboxes, our fathers tank-topped bum boys, our working class uncles feckless, our single mothers uppity, their children ill-raised and ignorant. You claim to have done so in context, but refuse to acknowledge the goons who come along, their knuckles dragging, to hurl your words at people of color passing, at immigrants, the working class, the vulnerable, who duck under fire as your context shatters above their heads, shards showering their flesh. Look how they hold each other as an act of rebellion. Close ranks around their young, whose foreheads glitter, dappled with blood, trying to laugh into the day's gaping mouth, to present a brave front, preserve their dignity, traditions, culture. No harsh words, they whisper to the petrified young. Respect your elders, they urge, but not him, they concede. Not you. Any guesses?
Does anyone want to type into chat who they think that person was that Inua was addressing in his poem there?
Yeah, Anja got it at one. I guess there's a hint in the title is Fuck 77, which follows Theresa May, who's Fuck 76.
Right,
So
right,
those
right.
were just questioning power. And as much as the book could have really takes in these huge political figures, they are smaller and sort of gentler poems, which I might read you. Let me see. Um, I read you fuck weak hugs. I hate weak hugs. You know those kind of ones where the arm just kind of drips over your shoulder. They don't really grip you. It's really nasty. And this is the poem written against that. Fuck weak hugs. The brain is a muscled residue of the cosmos, of dark matter and minuscule cells so spun from galaxies. What swirls inside also evades our sharpest probes. Our best minds can't fathom their dimmest lights zipping in their fleshy millions. Each thought a meteor rain, a cascading down of innumerable flares. This one compels my arms to hold your conglomerate of galaxies to mine. It means my world of worlds recognizes yours, wills you life and primordial warmth. But when your arms are slow to rise, limp to embrace, the part of me that dies, the surprise, that startled wisp of air on my lips, is a gossamer necklace of planets passing, a whole solar system gone. Fuck weak hugs. And let me see. So, also one of the ways in which the book is constructed is that the titles of subsequent poems are hidden in preceding poems. So, I'll give you an example. Let me see. Um, I mentioned primordial warmth in Fuck Week Hugs, and the same notion is. Hold on. Actually, no. Let me read. Let me read something else. Okay, let me just move on. Right. Let me read. Um, yeah. Let me read this one. Hold on. I've lost myself now. I had three different thoughts in my head, and they're just all forks now. Okay. Okay. I'll just start again. I'll read. I'll read. Fuck our future. Um. Yeah. Fuck our future. I'm just gonna dive into the poems that engage with climate change. Fuck our future. When our scorching planet ignites the last evacuating airship to cook its soft cargo of human flesh, an expanding fireball and fragment of its propeller blades thunk inches deep into tree trunks in the straggling forest beneath. What I want to know is which will survive. Which strain, which wood grain will hold encoded like a fingerprint pushed into wet clay that final day of reckoning when this cerulean blue ordained world we have corroded a toxic gray begins its self reclamation, starting with that tree. A lone lieutenant, a desperate sentinel, erect through the falling ball of fire, jet fuel, and smoldering meat, its face of leaves weighted with dust, its waist of branches noosed in plastic bags, yet standing, stubborn in its shaggy majesty, amidst the ship's carnage, like a righteous middle finger, thrust at all humanity, proud in the snarling sky. And the poem came from thinking about the tree like a middle finger to the sky, and just this proud thing protruding from earth, laughing down as the last human beings leave. Um, Probably when I was thinking about this poem, I was thinking about Wall-E, you know, the movie about the last little robot that's rolling around Earth, and all the human beings have left, and they're in the spaceship above, and because of low gravity, their bodies have become sort of oblong shaped. So I was thinking about Wally and also about climate change when this poem was beginning to grow. Um, Let me see. How much time do I have? Should I keep reading?
Got loads of time. Like we can do a bit of question and answers in like another 10 minutes or something, you know, if you want to just
Okay.
go
Okay.
at it as long as you want. You were saying initially you were going to give us an example of how the title of one poem is hidden
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
its previous one.
That was it. Yeah. Okay. Let me give you. Let me. Yeah. So I'll read you. Maybe the sequence. Um. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna read you. Well, these all kind of work together. Yeah. Okay. I'll read. Maybe I'll read "Fuck Nigeria." Okay. No, I'll read "Fuck Boko Haram" and "Fuck Deserts." Um, and "Fuck History," which is so the sequence of poems which really look at contemporary Nigerian politics. They start on page 58. There are "Fuck History," "Fuck Nigeria," "Fuck Boko Haram," and "Fuck Deserts." And they culminate with a poem called "Fuck Camel" and "Fuck Dust." So all of those things explore the imagery of the deserts. The tribe I descend from in northern Nigeria, where the desert dwellers, the nomads. So all of this is really one way of critiquing and looking closely at my lineage. Um, Fuck History was about the earliest conquest that happened across northern Nigeria, and about how that played out across my life. Um, and okay, I'll read this one. I'll start with this one. Fuck History. For the early years I spent skimming the half desert, half battlefield in northern Nigeria, I wonder if the ground misses me. If, in the fallow, shadowy holes I'd hide, giggling at my searching sisters, my toe prints are still held by the dust. What if my ancestors wear the dust? Which Fulani conquest spilled their blood? In which setting did they find romance? What if it is their meeting in me that spurs grains of sand to taste like sparks of clashing swords, like seeds of stars or moon nucleus? Sometimes I dream in Hausa and have no idea what is being said. Sometimes Arabic calligraphy looks to me like flowers on fire. What if the Quran is a pressed forest of burning trees? Is the call to prayer a line of low flames? What is it to miss a way of being I was too young to be? The largest possible quantity of anything is a lifetime. When my father returned from Hajj, doubting Islam, I was asleep. When the Imam's thug aimed an AK at our car, I still believed until I stared down the barrel and saw no light at the tunnel's end. So began a lifetime of questions, each page a desert, each thin blue line a cold horizon. All the waiting words are shards of parched stars, the looming stanzas like rising moons, an infinite infidel hiding in me. The second line contains the word Nigeria, but the second line begins in northern Nigeria, and then the subsequent poem after that is called "Fuck Nigeria," and this looks at what happens after that period of conflict between the Fulani who invaded the Hausa states, and which eventually were colonized and became part of the Nigerian country itself. So after those days and after Nigeria gained independence, Nigeria plunged into a really bloody civil war, which was the subject of the play that I wrote at the start of the year called Three Sisters. And I wrote this poem when I was writing that play, and it's called Fuck Nigeria. You are Nigerian until they massacre your elders, until the breeze blows thick with blood. You are defiant until they erase your home, burn your harvest, shred your clothes until the locals forget you built the road you walked in on. You disbelieve until they separate your husband from his head, your wife from her eyes, your brother from his belly, until your sister's drool thickens the dust and no limb stares when your child is called. You are an infidel until your parents ask you to leave, to pack a handkerchief with food and run. You are a refugee until the river spits you out, until the miles of woods and wilds of pastures stop clawing at your raw skin. You are brave until bullets and mosquitoes bite the night the same way, until bombs fall frequent as fruit, until any whistling empties your bladder. You are a wreck until the guns dance to silence, until your people fold, officially surrender. You are relieved until night sweats, trembling, and the swollen bellies of skeletal children begin haunting your every dream. For the scorched skin stretched across the skulls, and the looming eyes in your quiet hours. You are Biafran until you die, until the struggle breaks your back. Um, um, and now one of the things that happened after the Nigerian Civil War, also tying together the history in the poem "Fuck History" with contemporary Nigeria, is Boko Haram, and it's also tied with the growth of extremist Islam, which led to the civil war in the poem that I just described in "Fuck Nigeria." So this continues that history, and this is it. Fuck Boko Haram. So for those who don't know, Boko Haram, an extremist force in northern Nigeria, a few years ago they kidnapped 264 girls, and they kind of made news headlines after that. What isn't known about Boko Haram is that they had a much longer name before they were called Boko Haram. They were essentially a group of Muslim hippies in northern Nigeria. They were free loving, free caring. They camped around the large watering hole and did humanitarian work. They'd look after immigrants that strayed from northern Africa down towards the southern regions. When they got to Nigeria, the Nigerian government were ill equipped to look after them. So this group of hippie, nomadic, Sufi Muslims would just look after them. Now, the Nigerian government wanted the area in which they were camped around, so they tried to bully them to leave the area. They refused. They tried to starve them from the area. They were resilient. So eventually, the Nigerian government just got guns and mowed down a huge selection of their leaders, the leaders of this group. So they drove them out of Nigeria. They went up to Niger, Chad, got to grips with ISIS, and just came back to Nigeria pissed with guns and began to just run rife across that area, trying to reclaim their own ancestral lands. And they weren't called Boko Haram, they had another name. It was the CIA that first called them Boko Haram, and the nickname stuck. And that's where the title came from. Something else is I'm writing a play about this now. Again, so this is how everything starts. Everything starts as a poem for me. So something else that I discovered in researching Boko Haram is there was a language that existed in pre-colonial northern Nigeria, yeah, which was called Ajami. And Ajami was a way of localizing Arabic and using that to write down traditional Nigerian West African languages. So it's more of adapted lettering form based on Arabic. And Arabic was famous around that region because it was through that that the North Africans were learned to read and write, arithmetic, science, etc. So there was a huge like literary history and culture that existed in pre-colonial Africa, which this isn't really taught. But anyway, so when the British colonized that area, they began to force the Nigerians to write their own languages down with something called Boko, and Boko was a Latin script. So the Nigerians thought, this is terrible. Why should we rewrite our whole cultures in Boko? And that's the name of the alphabet. So they began to say, writing our cultures is haram. And Islam, haram just means is forbidden. So the first time the phrase Boko Haram popped up in West Africa, they were using it to say trying to have our, rewriting our culture, this foreign alphabet was wrong. But then the British journalists began to equip that with down with Western education, which wasn't the case at all, because they mistook Boko to mean book and thought they meant that book is haram, which wasn't the case. So all of these misinterpretations, deliberate misunderstandings, this lack of cultural translation and clarity gave rise to the foundling grounds, which gave birth to Boko Haram. But in any case, they are doing really horrible things across Nigeria right now. And this poem tries to make sense of the lineage of power and understand and just shows how power moves between the generations of men who are members of Boko Haram and the young ones that they pull into their numbers. Fuck Boko Haram. After the guns had danced the silence, the boy whose father was killed joined the others, sipping cough syrup in the tight corners of the parched village, their eyes hollow and hungry for things their widowed mothers could not provide. There were never enough schools to teach the possible rift between thought and action. The boys would lash out, wild as scuffling dogs in the scavenging heat, which the men who killed their fathers took for killer instincts and came back masked in the Quran's floral lilt, promising their empty bellies fulfillment, their empty hands purpose, empty lives love. The boys followed their lolling tongues into the desert, days and night, tottering past rattlesnakes and scorpions, as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had done, seeking his destiny in caves, where more stories of him were flattened like curved knives and slipped like drips of concrete into the broken parts of the breaking boys. Bit by bone, by brick, they were built into the militia of black flags and fire who return to the village now, guns dancing, who speak into the silence over the fresh corpses to the newly hungry and hollowed-eyed boys, promising fulfillment, purpose, love, their mouths like gardens blooming in the desert's bleak. Yeah. Should I start?
Thanks, I'm just going to jump in and say, I think maybe it'd be a good time if basically what I want to do is finish this evening by coercing you into, forcing you basically into reading one of my favorite poems of the collection, right? Which is Fuck Tommy Robinson.
Okay. Yeah.
But before that, I want to open up a Q&A. So anyone can just jump in and ask a question in the chat, and I'll kind of field these to Inua. But and I understand that people, it's going to take a little while for that to type. So instead of sitting in awkward silence, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, which I've wanted to ask you for a bit, but it's kind of weird to do business when we're just drinking tea together. So
Yeah.
I don't really ask you these things, but in this official sort of looking forum, I can ask you. Anyway, like often you talk about, and you spoke about earlier as well, like directness. You spoke about beauty and accessibility,
Mm.
right? But you also, how do you hold that together? How do you hold that intention with the level of rigor that you exercise in your poems, often through a degree of narrative progression or a broken narrative? So you have like this rigorous narrative in which this very specific information and very specific emotion that you're writing into is progressed, and sometimes there it just progresses right the way through to its logical conclusion, and sometimes you shift that in a different direction.
Mm.
You do those two things really, really well, but also you ensure that the poems are always beautifully sort of, there's a spoken beauty in them, and
Yeah.
they always feel relatively direct and accessible. How do you kind of juggle those things or hold them in tension?
Um, I think a couple of things is yeah, there are things in my life that have necessitated that, and then there's an editing process which also governs that. Like I said, I left Nigeria when I was a kid, came to the UK, left the UK, went to Ireland, left Ireland and came back. And I left when I was 12 years old, when I was 15, and when I was 18. So at really pivotal moments of my life, I find myself leaving everyone that I loved, going again and rebuilding communities, which meant that I needed to translate my cultures over and over again. So part of my growth was understanding how to tell stories, how to plate myself in narratives and understand the narratives happening around me, and being as rigorously myself as possible by making sure that I was in continuum with the cultures around me. So I think I've been doing that since I was 12 in one way, shape, or form. So telling stories, trying to pare things down, and making sure that whoever comes to me will understand where I've come from and who I am and how I operate has been just fundamental to my humanity, to operating through spaces. And also because of the various interests I have as an artist, working in the visual sectors in theater, radio, film, television, being able to always constantly culturally translate is fundamental to my practice. So being very open, very clear has just always been there. But also, there's something Stephen King said, which I really loved. He said, you know, you should write with the door closed, but edit with the door open. And that is really how I look at my poems. I consider that if a Mongolian goat herdman was to walk into my room after the first draft and sat beside me and were leaning in to look at my poems, would they understand those poems? How can I make them understand me and the world as I see it? And that always requires a clarity and a sieving over and over again. And in terms of the mellifluous nature and the spoken nature of my poems, there's a strong oral storytelling tradition in West Africa, which is still played out to this day. It was what led me subsequently to sharing my poetry in audience. I came from a performance background, and also growing up and listening to hip hop and understanding what sonics and what pleasures and what precisions and how and what rappers could do with syntax, the multiple allusions and cross references, ways that they create structure and form just from the sound of words itself, and ways that they could lead their audiences into something hypnotic, really, and guide them through really treacherous narratives and difficult things. Um, really struck me when I was a kid, when I first started writing. And for me, there's a duty of care about my audiences because some of the poems I'm writing is difficult. They're really hard subject matter, and I think to make the poems beautiful to listen to is one way to lull them into the world without doing that to their senses, to their spirit. So yeah, those are the kind of things that spear me through my writing process.
I love the idea of duty of care to your audience and to your readership, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
and the idea there's an idea of empathy that you seem to extend towards the audience. Like we always, as writers, expect a level of empathy from the audience, don't we? Even just the fact that they come to your shows or they read your books, they take the time to do that, and it seems very much that you understand that as an exchange, a give and take. They need to get something as well as just be the person to consistently extend empathy to the writer. And that's something that has been demonstrated in your work over and over again. We've got a couple of questions, which I think we can conflate. I'd like to invite additional questions if you want, while I just ask one last thing, which is that you were speaking about in your work and in your practice that like an endless sense of revision,
Mm.
yeah, like in your individual pieces and in your shows and in the things that you're making. Do you think you did that like as you're like the way that you started as a performer and where you are now, like, do you think the revision and has taken place since then? So, for example, when we first met, you were absolutely smashing it in terms of the spoken word as well as written stuff, and lots of your work um, was measured almost in minutes. Was like there was a length that you read for as opposed to a page that you wrote on often. And like now you've got these poems that are like less than a page long. You're thinking visually about them in terms of their shape. You're thinking about punctuation, or lack of punctuation, and the need for clarity and stuff like that. And I'm wondering how you got from one to the other, thinking of where you were when we first met and where you are now as an artist. Like, how did that sort of change?
Um, one, age. You get older and you can't just run around doing live performances every time. The winds begin to fall out of your sails faster. You just need to be home to rest. Two, I realized that I could work with actors who could travel around performing my work for me. And because of that, I could create more work that was being performed without me having to be there. Um, and three, I just found myself creating bigger pieces of work that required more time to sit in my flat and just think and just write. And yeah, and I think those are the reasons why. And these weren't like very clear, sort of conscious shifts. They just happened slowly over time. I went from being the main conduit for my work to passing it on to others and working with huge teams of people. And I think it's the theater industry that afforded me that. When I got tired of writing short 3-minute poems, I went on to writing longer poems, which became one-man shows. And slowly, from working and meeting actors, I realized that they could perform my shows for me, and then it just kind of spiraled and blew out of control. So yeah, that's kind of how it happened. And um, there is there's something, I think his name is Antonio Portia, said, a Russian poet. He says, "I know what I've given you, but not what you have received." And I found something really exciting in that offering to readers, where you're no longer there to share your poems. It just comes as book form, and I take of it and do what they will with it. Yeah, it just freed me from having to be too big brother like in how my poems are received, and I just like other people doing things with them now. Yeah.
That's really interesting, man. Let's move on. Just there's a few questions that have come in that a couple of them seem to relate to what you were just saying. So the first one is from Becky, who says, "I loved your version of Three Sisters. You said everything starts as a poem. How do you find moving between poetry and longer form film theatre? Do you think poetry helps you in those genres too, or is it quite a different process?"
um so how do I find moving between poetry and longer form? Well, like I said, everything begins with poetry for me. It begins as an idea for a poem, which blossoms. The stories or the ways of really contextualizing the poem don't exist within, or aren't done enough justice within one line or two lines, or the end of the final lines of the poem. They just came to grow bigger and bigger. Like the poem Boko Haram, fuck Boko Haram. In researching Boko Haram, I discovered all of that detail about the language, about the genesis, and it just kept on staying with me. And because my father was a Muslim when he married my mother, who was a Christian, being a multi-faith household and understanding the religious repercussions, I'm sorry, the repercussions of religion in Nigeria, which gave rise to Boko Haram, stayed with me. And it became a sequence of poems that I've been sort of tweaking over the last years. And it's now this epic play that I'm writing called Once Upon a Time in Sokoto. But it came from that idea of writing that poem to researching Boko Haram to the ideas and the structures and the voices getting bigger and bigger, crowding my head, crowding the subject matter, and then it becomes long form theater really. And poetry definitely helps me in those genres because poetry is the highest art form. I know, as poets, we have to say that, but it really is. It is the nexus of drama. It is the seed of conflict. You can create conflict just from words, juxtapose each other beside each other on a page. Poetry is a naturally dramatic art form, and it gains wings when there's someone sharing that on stage, bespeaking the narrative surrounding these words. So, poetry definitely helps my drama. Helps me focus in on conflict and figure out how to play it out, how to really raise the stakes up, how to just turn the volume up, and everything. And even the television series I'm writing now, most of them are narrated by an untrustworthy narrator who speaks with lots of imagery and and musicality in his voice, which means that he does what I'm able to do when I read to audiences. He can lull the viewers into false states of belief and securities and find ways to completely undermine them by just, rephrasing things difficultly and differently. Um, and yeah, so that's how it definitely helps my process. It aids my process. My process starts from there.
Great. We had a similar question from Rolly. Um, so we don't have to go into the we don't have to rehearse the same subject matter, but I do want to say, read out that they said the as someone who has never been to Nigeria and have a Nigerian name, you bring my father's homeland closer, which must be a lovely thing to hear.
Yeah, very much so.
Um, so Hannah says, it sounds like you go through your poems rigorously. When do you know a poem is done? Or do you feel a poem should always be revised endlessly?
Oh, I don't, so usually I know a poem is sort of done, one, when I've edited it about 6 or 7 times. And when I go back to it, all I'm doing is moving punctuation around or just changing, the things here and there. That's when I know the poem is close to completion. But even there, I never quite finish it um, until there's a deadline, if it was commissioned by something, or until the poem is published. And then I think, okay, if it exists now, other people own it, it's printed somewhere. I can't fuck around with it too much. So I think is the deadline, is time, which determines when the poem is finished. I say so even though there's a poem called "Fuck Time" and I rail against it. But yeah, that's how I end the poem.
No, the really interesting question here from Angela. What advice can you give for retracing your own culture and finding your own voice in it for someone who grew up with little exposure? So she says, I'm mixed white and Ghanaian and have never traveled to to my relatives,
Yeah.
experience and homeland. What do you think about that?
Um. One, again, just read. There's a whole lot of material out there that helps you bring you closer to yourselves. But also, try and find some way to travel. And I say that because I thought I knew a lot about my Nigerianhood, about my African identity, having grown in Nigeria, having grown up with black privilege, on understanding and living in a context in a world that I knew the color of my skin would not work against me. So when I came over to the UK, I was really confident in my identity. But after years of living here and watching Western cinema, I realized I had digested all the negative stereotypes of Africanhood and African masculinity, even though I was an African man. And in researching Barbershop Chronicles was when I realized just to what degree the illusion of barriers existed between myself and yeah, other Nigerians, other Ghanaians. I spent 6 weeks traveling across Africa on my own with a dictaphone, just spending time in barbers and clients. And I realized how little I knew, but how much I knew. How completely different we were, but how incredibly similar we are. And it's as simple as just going to visit. You don't need permission to do so, to walk into a hairdresser's and to try and speak. So do that and read as broadly as you can. That's what books do. That's what I did. But even now, when I go back to Nigeria, they call me an Oyinbo boy, which means a white boy, and they can tell that I'm not like an indigenous Nigerian from how I walk through marketplace. I don't understand how they do it, but yeah, they call me white boy when I'm in Nigeria. So despite all of these ways that I'm able to articulate my lineage on the continent, I'm a foreigner, and they know it, and they let me know it. Yeah, it never stops, it never goes away.
So interesting. So there's a couple of comments at the bottom that basically say, we don't want anything from you, Inua. We just want to tell you that we really enjoyed the reading, which again is lovely. So there's a great, so I'm going to wrap up with a question from Catherine,
Yeah.
and that's going to lead me on to ask you to read the Tommy Robinson poem, and then we're going to thank everyone for coming and thank you for coming uh, and look forward. Allow everyone to understand that you're going to be here with us for 2 years, so there are going to be other things to look forward to. So Catherine says, I love the readings and the thoughtful insights you gave. Thank you. You tackle some big topics and personal experiences in your poetry. In terms of a starting point, do you find yourself repeatedly getting insight from a particular place that helps you focus on a specific thought or feeling when writing about a broader topic?
Um, a particular place. Do you find yourself repeatedly getting insight from? There are three things that always. Yeah, there are three things that make a Venn diagram in which my spirit, my poetics sits. Three concepts, which a friend of mine called Musa Konga pointed out to me. Identity, displacement, and destiny. And whatever it is I'm working on, those three themes are present. However much I try to distance myself from it, they're there. Identity, because I'm Nigerian, I'm English, I'm Irish, I'm all of those things. Displacement, because I'm an immigrant, I've lived in various places, I've loved and lost a lot. And destiny, because of the sense of the sacredity which comes from being in a multi-faith household and being right up from an early age born into the concepts of God and going to the mosque and the church, all of those things. And even now, where I'm not a practicing Muslim or Christian, but I still believe in aspects of New Age belief structures and ways of perceiving and understanding the world. And I look for little things like that which prove that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. So all of those things pop out in everything that I write, and it's just always there. It means that I'm able to empathize with characters who are completely different from me, because I find that I'm drawn to them because they're suffering things that I have suffered. I'm just living through things that I've lived through. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So if it's cool with everyone, because we're pushing 6 o'clock now, and I know you've got another thing, typically in typical Inua Ellams fashion, you've got to run from here to go do another event. So is it all right, if it's all right with everyone, we'll just finish on hearing Inua, rather self-indulgently from my perspective, read my favorite poem from his collection.
Yeah. This is called Fuck Tommy Robinson. And I'm guessing you guys know who Tommy Robinson is. He's a bad dude. Well, I don't know. Can I say that objectively? Can you be objective? Maybe you can't be objective about someone like him.
I think that in terms of what we know about him is predominantly his actions, and
Yeah,
they're definitely not admirable actions, are
that's
they, at the moment?
very true. Yeah. Okay. So this is called Fuck Tommy Robinson. Because theirs is a progressive work, Tommy, you are less even than their slimy spirits. Indeed, you are what the slimy spirits of maggots are spooked with. Before birth, maggot spirit mothers tuck into rotten food and decomposing flesh, spirits of your young, warning. If you consider bad deeds, you'll be born without the enzymes we ooze to melt food. Or worse, the mothers warn, you become Tommy Robinson. In life, all the while chomping through decaying flesh, feasting on their wounded brethren, they chant, I'm not Tommy Robinson, I'm not Tommy Robinson, like field slave work songs, pushing them through the celestial, necessary, murky work to pupil stage, to eventual resurrection, where their spirits evolve upwards, unfurling into flies, their thorax emerald chrome, eyes burnished burgundy, their wings see-through blue and glazed with lightning.
Thanks so much, Inua. And thanks to everyone for coming. So this has been School of Humanities Creative Conversations event in conjunction with the Poetry Hub that we're running here. And Inua is going to be with us as a Poetry Fellow for another 2 years. So keep your eye out, both for events that we're running with Inua and also other creative conversation events that are going to be coming forward very soon. Thanks, everyone. And I hope you have the rest of your evening is very pleasant and there's some good news coming very soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, Wayne. Bye, guys.
Take care, anyway.